The warm spring afternoon started like any other day for Marcus and Sophia Henderson. The siblings walked along the tree-lined streets of their upscale neighborhood, their polished black shoes clicking against the clean sidewalk. Marcus, being 15, woke slightly ahead of his 13-year-old sister, occasionally looking back to make sure she was keeping up. Their private school uniforms stood out against the blooming cherry trees. Navy blue blazers with golden crests, crisp white shirts, and perfectly pressed pants for Marcus and a pleated skirt for Sophia. Both carried expensive leather backpacks, gifts from their father before his latest diplomatic mission to Geneva. "Did you see how Mr. Parker looked at me when I answered that question about international trade?" Marcus asked, adjusting his backpack strap. His sister smiled, remembering how their economics teacher had been impressed by Marcus's detailed knowledge of global commerce, knowledge that came naturally to the son of a diplomat. "Well, you did sound just like Dad," Sophia replied, reaching up to fix her neat braids. She carried her violin case in her other hand, getting ready for her evening practice at home. The instrument was a source of pride for her, having recently earned first chair in the school orchestra. As they walked, neither noticed the unmarked police car that had turned onto their street. Inside, two officers watched the teenagers with suspicious eyes. Officer Brian Miller nudged his partner, Officer James Thompson, and pointed toward the siblings. "Those two matched the description from the Highland Park burglaries," Miller muttered, referring to a series of break-ins that had occurred in the wealthy neighborhood over the past month. African-American, well-dressed, probably trying to blend in. The children continued their walk, completely unaware of the growing tension. They passed Mrs. Robinson's house, where the elderly woman was tending to her prize roses. She waved at them, as she did every afternoon. The Henderson children had become a familiar sight in the neighborhood since moving there 3 years ago when their father was appointed to his diplomatic position. Marcus checked his expensive watch, another gift from their father. "We should hurry," he said to Sophia. "Mom wants us to video call Dad at 4, and you know how he likes us to be on time." Their father had instilled in them a deep respect for punctuality, explaining that in diplomacy, being late could sometimes cause international incidents. The spring breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. A group of their schoolmates passed by on bikes, calling out friendly hellos. Marcus and Sophia were well-liked at school, known for their impeccable manners and academic achievements. Their mother, Dr. Henderson, had always emphasized the importance of excellence, reminding them that as a diplomatic family, they represented not just themselves but their country. Sophia pulled out her phone to check a text message from their mother, reminding them about the video call. The device was the latest model, equipped with special security features given their father's position. As she typed a quick reply, the unmarked police car slowly crept closer. The siblings were now just 3 blocks from their home, a stately colonial with diplomatic plates on the cars in the driveway. They passed the local coffee shop where they sometimes studied, and the owner, Mr. Chen, gave them a friendly wave through the window. "Should we get Mom's favorite coffee?" Sophia suggested, but Marcus shook his head. "We don't want to be late for Dad's call," he reminded her. "You know how busy he is with the UN conference." Neither teenager noticed how the police car had now parked, or how the two officers were stepping out, their faces set with determination. They were too busy discussing their days. Marcus's upcoming student council presentation and Sophia's violin recital next week. They were just children walking home from school, carrying books, instruments, and dreams. They were diplomatic kids who had lived in 3 different countries, who spoke multiple languages, and who had been taught to carry themselves with dignity and pride. They were American citizens who happened to be Black, unaware that in the next few moments, these various identities would collide in a way their father had always warned them about, but had hoped they would never experience. As the officers began to approach, the ordinary afternoon was about to become anything but routine. The peaceful afternoon shattered when a stern voice called out behind Marcus and Sophia. "Hey, you two, stop right there." Marcus turned first, his body instinctively moving to stand slightly in front of his younger sister. 2 police officers approached them quickly, their hands resting near their belts. Officer Miller, the taller of the two, had a deep frown on his face. Officer Thompson stayed a few steps behind, his eyes scanning the area. "Let me see some ID," Officer Miller demanded. His voice was loud enough that several people nearby turned to look. A woman pushing a stroller crossed to the other side of the street. "We're just walking home from school," Marcus said calmly, remembering his father's careful instructions about dealing with authority figures. He kept his hands visible, just as he had been taught. "We live 3 blocks from here." Sophia clutched her violin case closer, her hands trembling slightly. She had never seen police officers look so angry before, not even during their diplomatic visits to foreign countries. "There have been burglaries in this area," Officer Thompson said, stepping forward. "And you two match the description of our suspects." His eyes moved suspiciously between their expensive backpacks and school uniforms. Marcus slowly reached for his wallet. "Sir, we're diplomatic children. I have our ID cards right here." "Keep your hands where we can see them," Officer Miller snapped, causing Sophia to jump. "Put your bags on the ground. Both of you, step back." By now, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Chen from the coffee shop stood in her doorway, phone in hand. Across the street, one of their neighbors, Mr. Peterson, was recording everything from his front porch. "But my violin," Sophia started to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Put it down. Now," Officer Thompson ordered. Marcus gave his sister a small nod, and she carefully placed her precious instrument on the sidewalk. The siblings stood shoulder to shoulder as the officers approached their belongings. "Sit on the curb, both of you," Officer Miller commanded, pointing to the street edge. "Cross your ankles, hands on your knees." The concrete was cold and dirty, but they had no choice. Marcus helped Sophia sit down, whispering, "It's okay. Remember what Dad taught us. Stay calm." Officer Thompson roughly unzipped Marcus's backpack, dumping its contents onto the sidewalk. Textbooks, notebooks, and his laptop spilled out. The officer kicked them aside, searching for something else. "These look too expensive for you," Officer Miller commented, examining Sophia's phone and Marcus's watch. "Where did you get these?" "They were gifts from our father," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "He's Ambassador Henderson. If you check our school IDs." "Sure. And I'm the president," Officer Miller scoffed, continuing to search through their belongings. Just then, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "What on earth is going on here?" It was Mrs. Parker, their school principal, rushing down the sidewalk with 2 other teachers. "Ma'am, this is a police matter," Officer Thompson said firmly. "Please step back." "These are my students," Mrs. Parker insisted, her face flushed with anger. "Marcus and Sophia Henderson. Their father is a diplomat. I know them personally." Officer Miller ignored her, roughly handling Sophia's violin case. Tears filled the young girl's eyes as he carelessly placed it back down. More phones appeared in windows and doorways, recording the scene. A car slowed down, the driver watching the situation unfold. The siblings sat perfectly still, their expensive uniforms getting dirty from the curb, their belongings scattered around them like fallen leaves. "I'm calling their mother right now," Mrs. Parker announced, pulling out her phone. "And the embassy." The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Officer Miller finally picked up one of the scattered ID cards, his face changing as he read the diplomatic credentials. "Stand up slowly," he ordered, his voice less confident now. Against the wall. Marcus helped his sister up, their uniforms stained from sitting on the curb. They stood against the cold brick wall of the coffee shop while the officers huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. The crowd had grown larger. Phones kept recording, and somewhere in Geneva, their father's phone was about to ring with news that would bring him racing home, turning this simple afternoon into an international incident that would change many lives forever. The next few minutes felt like hours for Marcus and Sophia as they stood against the wall of the coffee shop. Officer Miller held their diplomatic ID cards in his hands, his face growing paler as he realized his mistake, but instead of apologizing, he seemed to become more aggressive. "These could be fake," he announced loudly, pocketing the IDs. "We need to do a thorough search." Sophia's lower lip trembled as Officer Thompson approached her backpack again. The officer dumped everything onto the sidewalk, her notebooks covered in neat handwriting, textbooks with carefully decorated covers, and the lunch container her mother had packed that morning. Her favorite pen, a birthday gift from her father, rolled into a drain. "Please, those are our school things," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady, He could see Mr. Chen still recording everything from his coffee shop window. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and many had their phones out. Mrs. Parker, their school principal, was now on two phones at once. With one hand, she spoke urgently to their mother. With the other, she was calling the school board. "This is completely unacceptable," they could hear her saying. "These are diplomatic children being harassed." Officer Miller turned to Marcus. "Empty your pockets." Slowly. Marcus carefully pulled out his phone, keys, and wallet. His hands shook slightly, but he remembered his father's words from long ago: "Always stay dignified, no matter what happens." A group of their classmates had stopped on their bikes, watching in shock. Sarah, Sophia's best friend, covered her mouth with her hand as she saw Sophia's violin case being roughly handled. "Officer, please be careful with that," Sophia pleaded softly. "It's very special to me." The officer ignored her, opening the case and carelessly moving the instrument aside. The violin, passed down from their grandmother, shifted dangerously in its case. More teachers from their school had arrived now. Mr. Watson, their history teacher, was trying to reason with the officers. "I taught these children for 3 years. Their father is Ambassador Henderson. This is a terrible mistake." But the officers continued their search. They went through every pocket of both backpacks, every folder, every book. Marcus's laptop was examined and put aside roughly. Sophia's sheet music scattered in the wind, and some pages flew into a puddle. "Look at their uniforms," someone in the crowd said loudly. "They're from Brighton Academy. Those kids aren't burglars." Officer Thompson finally found their school IDs in a pocket of Marcus's backpack. He stared at them for a long moment, then showed them to his partner. The mood shifted slightly as they realized these really were who they claimed to be. Mrs. Parker was now reading something from her phone. "Their mother, Dr. Henderson, is on her way, and the embassy has been notified. The Diplomatic Security Service is coming." The words "Diplomatic Security Service" seemed to finally get through to the officers. Officer Miller's face turned a shade whiter. "You can step away from the wall now," he said, his voice less commanding than before. "But don't leave the area. We need to verify a few more things." Marcus helped Sophia gather her wet sheet music. Their perfect uniforms were dirty from the wall and the curb. Sophia's eyes were red from holding back tears, but she hadn't cried. Marcus felt proud of his sister's strength. Their classmates helped pick up scattered papers and books. Sarah hugged Sophia tightly, while others helped dry off the wet sheet music. The community was rallying around them, but the damage had been done. Mr. Chen came out of his shop with 2 hot chocolates. "Here," he said kindly, handing them the warm cups. "Drink these while we wait for your mother." Yet officers stood awkwardly nearby, speaking quietly into their radios. They kept glancing at the growing crowd, at the many phones still recording, at the school officials on their phones, and at the 2 dignified children they had just humiliated for no reason. In the distance, they could hear sirens. Someone said they could see diplomatic vehicles approaching. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the scattered belongings of 2 innocent children who had simply been walking home from school. The world was about to learn their names, but not for the reasons Marcus and Sophia had ever wanted or imagined. The diplomatic vehicles arrived with flashing lights but no sirens. 3 black SUVs pulled up smoothly to the curb, and men in dark suits stepped out. Their mother, Dr. Helena Henderson, emerged from the second vehicle, her face calm but her eyes blazing with controlled anger. "Mama," Sophia whispered, taking a small step forward. But Marcus held her back gently, remembering their father's teachings about protocol in public situations. Dr. Henderson, dressed in a crisp business suit, approached with 2 diplomatic security agents beside her. She was a striking figure, tall, elegant, and carrying herself with the perfect posture of someone used to international meetings. Her heels clicked purposefully against the pavement. "My children," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the now quiet street. "Are you hurt?" "No, Mama," they answered together. Marcus still held his sister's hand, both of them standing straight despite their dirty uniforms. Their mother turned to face Officers Miller and Thompson. The 2 policemen seemed to shrink under her steady gaze. "I believe you have my children's diplomatic identification cards," she said, extending her hand. Officer Miller fumbled in his pocket, quickly returning the IDs. His face had turned red, and sweat showed on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. The diplomatic security agents moved efficiently, documenting everything. One agent took photos of the children's scattered belongings, while another recorded statements from the witnesses who had been filming. Mrs. Parker, the school principal, handed over her phone with its recording of her calls to the embassy. "Look at this," one agent said, carefully examining Sophia's violin case. There was a new scratch on its surface, and the violin inside had shifted from its proper position. Dr. Henderson's expression tightened as she saw her mother's precious instrument treated so carelessly. The local police chief had arrived now, hurrying from his car with a look of alarm on his face. He went straight to Dr. Henderson, already starting to apologize. "Dr. Henderson, I cannot express how deeply sorry we are for this incident." She held up one hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Chief Roberts, I suggest we continue this discussion through proper diplomatic channels. At the moment, my priority is my children's well-being." Mr. Chen from the coffee shop approached carefully, carrying a bag. "I packed some fresh pastries for the children," he said quietly. "And I have all the security footage from my shop cameras if you need it." The diplomatic security team quickly took his contact information. More evidence for what was becoming a serious international incident. Officers Miller and Thompson stood awkwardly to the side, their earlier confidence completely gone. Their supervisor had arrived and was speaking to them in harsh whispers. Both officers kept glancing at the children, then quickly looking away when they met Dr. Henderson's stern gaze. "Marcus, Sophia," their mother said softly, "go with Agent Rivera to the car. She'll take you home." But Sophia turned to her scattered sheet music first. Her friend Sarah was still helping to gather the wet pages. "My music," she said quietly. "Will replace everything," Dr. Henderson assured her, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Every single thing they damaged will be replaced." The crowd had grown even larger now. News vans were starting to arrive, their reporters setting up cameras. The story of 2 diplomatic children being wrongfully searched was spreading quickly across social media. Phones were still recording everything. As Marcus and Sophia walked to the diplomatic vehicle, they held their heads high despite their dirty uniforms and tear-stained faces. Their mother had taught them well, dignity in all situations, just like their father. "Your father is on his way home," Dr. Henderson told them as Agent Rivera opened the car door. "He's already left Geneva." The children nodded, knowing what this meant. Their father, Ambassador James Henderson, never left important diplomatic meetings early. If he was coming home, this incident was about to become much bigger than a simple police mistake. As the diplomatic vehicle pulled away, Marcus and Sophia could see their mother staying behind with the security team, her straight back and proud posture sending a clear message to everyone watching. This would not be ignored or forgotten. The afternoon sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the scattered remains of what should have been just another normal day after school. Ambassador James Henderson sat in his private jet as it crossed the Atlantic Ocean, his laptop open to multiple news websites. The video of his children being searched had gone viral. His dark eyes narrowed as he watched his daughter's violin case being carelessly handled, his son standing protective and tall despite his fear. The plane's satellite phone rang again. It was the 3rd call from the State Department in the last hour. Ambassador Henderson answered it with the same calm dignity he was famous for in diplomatic circles. "Yes, Secretary Williams," he said, his deep voice steady. "I'll be landing in 4 hours. And yes, I expect full cooperation from the local police department." He paused, listening. "No, I don't want this quietly handled. My children were humiliated in public. The response will be public as well." In the embassy's legal office, a team of lawyers worked through the night. They collected videos from witnesses, statements from teachers, and security footage from nearby businesses. Mr. Chen's coffee shop camera had captured everything perfectly, showing how the police had followed the children for 3 blocks before stopping them. Dr. Helena Henderson sat in their home study, speaking to reporters on video calls. She was careful with her words, but her message was clear. "My children were targeted for one reason only," she said, her voice firm. "And that reason goes against everything our diplomatic mission stands for." Upstairs, Marcus and Sophia tried to sleep but couldn't. They could hear their mother's voice from downstairs, the constant ringing of phones, and the occasional flash of cameras outside their gates. News vans lined their street. "Do you think Dad is angry?" Sofia whispered to her brother. She had sneaked into his room, just like she used to do during thunderstorms when they were younger. Marcus sat up in his bed. "Not at us," he said quietly. "Dad always says how we handle difficult situations shows who we really are. We did exactly what he taught us." Meanwhile, at the police station, officers Miller and Thompson sat in separate rooms, writing detailed reports. Their supervisor paced outside, taking call after call from city officials. The mayor had already issued an emergency statement promising a full investigation. Social media was exploding with the story. The hashtag diplomatic children was trending worldwide. People shared the videos, comparing the children's dignified behavior with the officers' aggressive actions. Ambassador Henderson's phone buzzed with a message from the UN Secretary General. "James, just saw the news. Take whatever actions necessary. You have our full support." The plane crossed into U.S. airspace as dawn approached. Ambassador Henderson reviewed the documents his legal team had prepared. Every violation of diplomatic protocols was listed. Every international law that had been broken was cited. But what caught his eye was a small detail in one report. His daughter's ruined sheet music had been for a peace concert at the embassy next month. In their home, Dr. Henderson finally climbed the stairs to check on her children. She found them both in Marcus's room, sleeping sitting up against the headboard. They were still in their dirty school uniforms, holding hands like they used to do as toddlers during their first diplomatic posting in Europe. She covered them with a blanket, careful not to wake them. On Marcus's desk lay his student council speech about international understanding. Next to it was Sophia's violin case, the new scratch visible in the morning light. The embassy's security team patrolled outside, keeping the growing media crowd at a safe distance. Phones rang in every room downstairs as more diplomatic missions called to offer support. The French ambassador, a close family friend, had already released a statement condemning the incident. Dr. Henderson's phone vibrated, a message from her husband. "Landing in 3 hours. Keep our children close. What happened to them ends today." She looked out the window at the rising sun. In diplomatic circles, Ambassador Henderson was known as a calm negotiator, a man who could find peaceful solutions to the most difficult international conflicts. But this was different. This was personal. The morning news shows were all leading with the story. Experts discussed diplomatic immunity, racial profiling, and international law. But in their home, 2 children finally slept, unaware that their quiet walk home from school was about to change police policies across the nation. Their father's plane continued its approach to the city, carrying with it the full weight of diplomatic consequences that no one in that police department had considered when they decided to stop 2 innocent children on their way home from school. By morning, news trucks surrounded the police station. Reporters stood in neat rows, their microphones ready, cameras pointed at the building's entrance. The story of the Henderson children had exploded overnight into national news. Inside the station, Chief Roberts watched the morning news shows with a growing sense of dread. Every major network was playing the videos. The security footage from Mr. Chen's coffee shop was particularly damaging. It clearly showed officers Miller and Thompson following the children for 3 blocks before stopping them. "And here we can see," a CNN reporter said, pointing to the footage, 2 diplomatic children, ages 13 and 15, being forced to sit on the curb while their belongings are scattered. Note their school uniforms, their proper behavior, and the growing crowd of witnesses. On another channel, a former diplomat spoke angrily. These officers violated not just civil rights, but international diplomatic laws. Ambassador Henderson's children have diplomatic immunity. Even approaching them without going through proper channels was illegal. Social media was even worse. New videos kept appearing, different angles of the same incident, each one showing Marcus and Sophia's dignity in the face of humiliation. Their story was trending worldwide, with millions of shares and comments. At Brighton Academy, students arrived wearing black armbands in support of their classmates. Sarah, Sophia's best friend, gave an interview to the local news. "Sophia was practicing for the embassy's peace concert," Sarah said, holding up the wet, damaged sheet music. "She's first chair violin. She was going to play for diplomats from 20 countries. Look what they did to her music." The school's music department released a statement about Sophia's violin. a family heirloom that had survived 2 wars and 3 generations before being damaged in a wrongful police search. Marcus's student council speech, found in his scattered belongings, had gone viral too. Someone had photographed the paper titled "Building Bridges Between Nations," now stained from being thrown on the wet sidewalk. The irony was not lost on anyone. Inside the Henderson home, Dr. Helena Henderson prepared for a press conference. She chose her outfit carefully, a diplomatic blue suit that projected both authority and approachability. As she adjusted her collar, she could hear the media helicopters hovering above their house. "Mom," Marcus called from the doorway. "They're showing the videos again." Dr. Henderson turned to see her son, still in his pajamas, looking younger than his 15 years. "Are you and Sophia okay watching this?" "Dad always says we should know what's happening," Marcus replied, "but Sophia keeps crying about her violin." In the living room, Sophia sat curled up on the couch, watching as experts discussed diplomatic law on television. Her damaged violin case sat beside her, a visible reminder of yesterday's events. The family's phones kept ringing. Other diplomatic families called to offer support. The French ambassador's daughter, Sophia's close friend, had posted a powerful message online about growing up as a diplomatic child in America. At the police station, officers Miller and Thompson arrived for their disciplinary hearing. They pushed through crowds of angry protesters holding signs that read "Diplomatic Rights Matter" and "Protect Our International Children." The mayor called an emergency press conference. "We are taking this incident extremely seriously," she announced, looking nervous. The officers involved had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. But the biggest news was still coming. Ambassador Henderson's private jet had landed. Cameras caught him walking down the steps, his face stern but composed. Unlike most diplomatic incidents, which he handled with smiles and handshakes, his expression showed no warmth. "Ambassador," reporters called out, "what actions will you take?" He stopped briefly, adjusting his tie. A gesture millions would soon recognize as his moment of controlled anger. "When you violate the rights of diplomatic children," he said clearly, "you don't just create an incident, you create a movement." Those words immediately became headlines everywhere. Within minutes, #CreateAMovement started trending alongside #DiplomaticChildren. Back at home, Marcus and Sophia watched their father on TV. They saw the familiar way he straightened his shoulders before facing difficult situations, just as he had taught them to do. "He's going to change things," Marcus said to his sister. Sophia nodded, gently touching her grandmother's damaged violin. "Dad always says that sometimes it takes one small incident to fix a big problem." Outside their window, more news vans arrived. The story of 2 dignified children and their violated rights was about to become much bigger than anyone had expected. Ambassador James Henderson walked into the police station exactly at 10:00 a.m., his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He wore his best diplomatic suit and carried a thick folder under his arm. 2 embassy lawyers followed him, along with Dr. Helena Henderson and a diplomatic security team. The police station's conference room was tense. Chief Roberts sat with the mayor, city council members, and their legal team. Officers Miller and Thompson were there too, looking uncomfortable in their dress uniforms. Their union representative nervously shuffled papers. Ambassador Henderson took his seat calmly, placing the folder on the table. The room fell silent. Everyone expected anger, shouting, or threats. Instead, his quiet voice carried more power than any angry outburst could. "Before we begin," he said, opening the folder, "I want you to watch something." He nodded to one of his lawyers, who connected a laptop to the room's large screen. The video began playing, but it wasn't the viral footage everyone had seen. This was different. "This is my son Marcus, age 6, giving his first speech at the United Nations Children's Day," Ambassador Henderson narrated as young Marcus appeared on screen. "And this is Sophia, age 8, playing violin at a peace concert in Geneva." More videos played, the children at diplomatic functions, meeting world leaders, helping at embassy events. Their whole lives of service and dignity displayed for the room to see. "These are the children your officers threw onto a curb," he continued, his voice still calm. "These are the diplomatic representatives your department humiliated." Chief Roberts tried to speak. "Ambassador, we deeply regret." Ambassador Henderson held up his hand. The chief fell silent immediately. Now, the ambassador said, pulling out documents. Let's discuss what happens next. He laid out papers one by one. First, international law violations. Section 37 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the protection of diplomatic families. The city's lawyers looked increasingly worried as he continued. Second, civil rights violations. My children were targeted for one reason only. He paused, letting the obvious truth hang in the air. Third, damage to diplomatic property, including a historic violin that survived World War II, only to be damaged by your officers. Officers Miller and Thompson stared at the table, unable to meet his eyes. Dr. Henderson spoke next, her voice steady. Our children came home with dirty uniforms and tears in their eyes. But they maintained their dignity your officers never showed them. The mayor tried to save the situation. We're prepared to offer a settlement. This isn't about money, Ambassador Henderson interrupted. This is about change. He pulled out another document. Here are our demands. The list was long. New training programs for police, mandatory diplomatic protocol education, community oversight committees, and regular meetings between law enforcement and diplomatic families. But most importantly, he continued, looking directly at Officers Miller and Thompson, I want you to face my children and explain your actions to them. The room grew even quieter. The officers looked terrified at the prospect. Not for punishment, Ambassador Henderson clarified, but for understanding. They deserved to know why they were treated like criminals on their walk home from school. Chief Roberts wiped sweat from his forehead. When would you like this meeting to happen? Now, Ambassador Henderson replied. My children are waiting outside. The door opened, and Marcus and Sophia entered, still in their school uniforms but fresh ones today. They stood tall, just as they had been taught, facing the officers who had humiliated them. Officer Miller spoke first, his voice shaky. We made a terrible mistake. Why did you follow us? Marcus asked quietly. We walk that route every day. Officer Thompson couldn't meet their eyes. We had reports of burglaries. We just assumed. You assumed? Sophia said softly, holding her damaged violin case. Because of how we look? The silence in the room was heavy. Ambassador Henderson watched proudly as his children showed more wisdom and grace than the adults who had wronged them. Your assumptions hurt people, Marcus continued. They hurt families. They hurt trust. The mayor was crying quietly. Chief Roberts looked like he wanted to disappear. The lawyers had stopped taking notes. Just listening to these diplomatic children teach a lesson in humanity. Ambassador Henderson smiled slightly. This was diplomacy at its finest, not through anger or force, but through understanding and dignity. His children were proving to be better diplomats than anyone in the room. The city hall steps were crowded with reporters, cameras, and concerned citizens on a bright Thursday morning. Police Chief Roberts stood at the podium, sweating under the hot lights of news cameras. Ambassador Henderson stood to his right, calm and dignified as always, while Marcus and Sophia sat with their mother in the front row. Today, Chief Roberts began, his voice shaking slightly. We acknowledge a grave mistake made by our department, a mistake that revealed deep problems in our system. Camera flashes lit up the morning air. Reporters leaned forward with their microphones, knowing this was more than just another police apology. 2 days ago, officers Miller and Thompson wrongfully stopped and searched 2 young diplomatic children, Marcus and Sophia Henderson. The chief paused, looking directly at the children. Their only crime was walking home from school while being black. A murmur went through the crowd. No one had expected such direct honesty from the chief. Officers Miller and Thompson stood to the side, heads bowed. They wore their dress uniforms, looking uncomfortable as cameras turned to capture their expressions. These children, the chief continued, showed more dignity and grace during their ordeal than our officers showed authority and judgment. While our officers forgot their training, these young people remembered their diplomatic teachings. In the front row, Sophia held her damaged violin case in her lap. The morning sun caught the new scratch on its surface, a visible reminder of that afternoon. Marcus sat straight-backed beside her, his student council president pin shining on his blazer. As of today, Chief Roberts announced, our department is making major changes. He listed them one by one. a new training program about diplomatic protocols and rights, community oversight committees including diplomatic families, monthly meetings between police and international residents, body cameras to be worn at all times, cultural sensitivity training for all officers. Officer Miller stepped forward next. His voice was quiet, but the microphones carried his words clearly. "I want to apologize directly to Marcus and Sophia," he said. "We acted on prejudice, not proof. We caused harm, not help. Your dignity showed us our disgrace." Officer Thompson spoke next, tears in his eyes. "That violin we damaged," he said, looking at Sophia. "I learned it survived World War II. It was your grandmother's. No apology can fix that history we harmed." Dr. Henderson squeezed her daughter's hand as Sophia fought back tears. Ambassador Henderson moved to the podium. The crowd fell completely silent. Everyone expected diplomatic anger, political threats, or legal actions. Instead, he smiled gently. "Today marks a beginning, not an end," he said. "My children have taught us all a valuable lesson. Change doesn't come from anger. It comes from understanding." He gestured to Marcus and Sophia to join him. They walked up, standing tall beside their father. "These officers will not be fired," Ambassador Henderson announced, surprising everyone. "Instead, they will work with our embassy's youth program. They will learn from our children, and our children will learn from them. This is how we build bridges, not walls." Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment. Two apologetic officers facing two dignified children, with their diplomat father bridging the gap between them. The mayor stepped forward with two envelopes. "As part of our apology," she said, "the city is establishing 2 scholarships in your names. The Marcus Henderson Leadership Scholarship and the Sophia Henderson Arts Scholarship will help other young people show the same dignity and strength you displayed." Sophia looked up at her father, who nodded encouragingly. She stepped to the microphone. "My violin was damaged," she said softly, "but music can heal. I invite Officers Miller and Thompson to attend my next peace concert at the embassy." Marcus spoke next, "And I invite them to hear my student council speech about building international understanding. Because sometimes the hardest borders to cross are in our own minds." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters wiped tears from their eyes even as they took notes. The police chief shook hands with Ambassador Henderson while cameras flashed. As the morning sun rose higher, its light fell on an unusual group on the city hall steps. 2 diplomatic children, 2 humble police officers, and 1 ambassador who had turned a moment of prejudice into a lesson in peace. The world was watching, and change was beginning, one small step at a time. 1 month after the incident, Marcus and Sophia Henderson walked the same route home from school. This time, things were different. Officer Miller stood outside Mr. Chen's coffee shop, greeting students as they passed by. He was in charge of the new community outreach program. "Good afternoon, Marcus, Sophia," he called out with a respectful nod. The officer was no longer the same man who had stopped them a month ago. Working with diplomatic families had changed him deeply. Inside the coffee shop, Mr. Chen had hung a framed photo on his wall. It showed Sophia playing her restored violin at the embassy's peace concert last week. Next to it was a newspaper article about Marcus's award-winning speech on international understanding. "Your usual hot chocolates?" Mr. Chen asked with a smile as they stepped inside. The shop had become a symbol of community healing, a place where police officers and diplomatic families now met regularly for coffee and conversation. At the police station, major changes were visible. Photos of different diplomatic families hung in the entrance hall, with information about their countries and cultures. Officer Thompson stood in front of a group of new recruits, teaching them about diplomatic protocols and international relations. "Remember," he told them, pointing to a picture of Marcus and Sophia, "these children taught us our most important lesson: never judge by appearance. Never act without understanding." At Brighton Academy, Principal Parker had started a new tradition. Every morning, students from different backgrounds shared their stories during assembly. Today, it was Sophia's turn. "My grandmother's violin survived a war," she told her classmates, holding the restored instrument. "And now it has survived prejudice too. Music speaks all languages, bridges all differences." Marcus sat in the audience, wearing his student council president badge. Next to him was Officer Miller's daughter, would join the student council after her father's experience changed their family's perspective. At the embassy, Ambassador Henderson met with other diplomats. The incident had sparked a nationwide movement. Police departments across the country were adopting what they now call the Henderson Protocols, new guidelines for interacting with international residents. Your children turned a moment of hatred into a mission of hope, the French ambassador told him, looking at the latest statistics. Reports of police incidents involving diplomatic families had dropped dramatically. Dr. Henderson had also created change. She started a monthly dinner where police officers' families and diplomatic families shared meals together. Tonight was pizza night, and officers Miller and Thompson's children were excited to try foods from different countries. In the police academy, new cadets now watched a required video. It showed Marcus and Sophia's incident, followed by interviews with the officers involved. "We thought we were following suspects," Officer Miller said in the video. "Instead, we were following our own prejudices. These children became our teachers." After school, Marcus and Sophia visited the youth center they had helped create. Police officers and diplomatic children worked together here, breaking down barriers through sports, art, and conversation. "Remember when we were scared to walk this street?" Sophia asked her brother as they left the center. "Now look at everything that's changed." Marcus nodded, watching Officer Thompson coach a basketball game between local kids and diplomatic children. "Dad always says that true diplomacy happens in small moments, not just big meetings." At home that evening, the Henderson family sat down for dinner. Ambassador Henderson looked at his children proudly. Marcus was wearing his debate team medal. He had just won a citywide competition speaking about community policing. Sophia carefully placed her violin case on the shelf. The repaired scratch remained as a reminder, but now it told a story of healing rather than hurt. She was preparing for another concert, this time with Officer Miller's daughter playing piano alongside her. "Your grandmother would be proud," Dr. Henderson said, looking at the violin. "Her instrument is still bringing people together, just in a different way than she imagined." As the sun set outside their window, the sounds of children playing basketball drifted up from the street. Officer Miller's evening patrol car drove by slowly, not with suspicion, but with protection. Marcus and Sophia Henderson had walked home from school one afternoon and walked into history. Their dignity had turned a moment of prejudice into a movement of change. Now, their story was taught in police academies, diplomatic training programs, and schools across the nation. The incident that began with 2 children being forced to sit on a curb had ended with an entire community standing up for change, and it all started with a simple walk home from school.